Let me be clear with you from the very beginning. This is not a comfortable book. If you're looking for reassurance, for gentle explanations about why you are the way you are, for comforting stories that protect your self-image, you will not find them here. What you will find instead is a confrontation, because there is something about you that you have spent your entire life avoiding, not by accident, but by design. And the moment you begin to see it clearly, you will not be able to unsee it. Most people believe they know themselves. They believe their thoughts are their own, their choices are deliberate, their personality is something stable, something honest. This belief is not just wrong, it is necessary, because without it, the illusion would collapse. Beneath the version of yourself that you show to the world, and more importantly, the version you show to yourself, there is another layer, older, faster, less polite, a hidden structure of impulses, contradictions, and denied truths that quietly shapes everything you do. This is what Carl Gustav Jung called the shadow, and it is not a metaphor. The shadow is not just your dark side. It is everything in you that has been rejected, suppressed, or pushed out of awareness, because it did not fit the person you were taught you should be. Your anger, your envy, your need for control, your capacity for cruelty, your hunger for validation, not erased, just buried. And what is buried does not disappear, it operates. Here is the truth most people spend their lives avoiding. The parts of yourself you refuse to see are the parts that control you the most. They shape your decisions before you are aware of them. They distort your relationships while you believe you are acting rationally. They whisper justifications that sound like logic, but are in fact defense. You do not outgrow your shadow, you act it out. Some part of you already knows this. That moment of discomfort when you judge someone and feel something familiar underneath. That reaction that feels too strong for the situation. That quiet voice that tells you, this isn't the full story. That is not weakness. That is recognition. And if you feel resistance right now, if part of you wants to dismiss this, to scroll away, to return to something easier, pay attention to that. Because the part of you that wants to avoid this is the part this book is about. This is not self-help. This is exposure, not of the world, of you. The ideas in this book are not built on opinion or optimism, or the need to make you feel better. They are drawn from patterns, psychological, historical, and deeply human patterns, observed across time, culture, and experience. Patterns that repeat whether we acknowledge them or not. Confronting your shadow is not a casual exercise. It is not something you do for entertainment. As Jung himself warned in Aeon, it is a problem that challenges the entire structure of who you believe yourself to be. And once you begin, there is no clean way to go back. But here is the part most people misunderstand. The shadow is not your enemy. It is not evil. It is what happens to the parts of you that were never allowed to exist. Ignored, they become distorted. Suppressed, they become reactive. Denied, they become dangerous. But understood, they become power. This book is built around 30 brutal truths. Not to shame you, not to break you, but to remove the illusion that keeps you limited. Because the real danger is not in seeing your darkness. The real danger is living it without knowing. So read this carefully, read it honestly. And more importantly, read it all the way through. Because what you are about to face is not a monster. It only looks like one. Until you finally have the courage to see it clearly. Part 1. The shadow exists, and it's running your life. Truth 1. You are not who you think you are. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. Friend, I need you to sit with this for a moment. The person you present to the world, the name you introduce yourself with, the values you publicly espouse, the personality you perform in meetings, at family dinners, and on social media, that is what Jung called the persona. The word comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in ancient Greek theater. It is a mask, a necessary one perhaps, but a mask nonetheless. Jung identified the persona as the first major structure of the psyche you develop in early life. From the moment you entered the social world, You began learning what expressions earned approval and what behaviors triggered rejection. You learned to smile when you were angry, to say "I'm fine" when you were devastated, to suppress your weirdness in public and reserve it for private moments, or suppress it entirely. Over years and decades, the mask becomes so familiar that you forget it is there. You begin to identify with it completely. You are the reliable one, the cheerful one, the responsible one. But underneath the persona lies the totality of who you actually are, including all the qualities you have buried. Studies in social psychology confirm what Jung observed clinically. People have very limited awareness of their own motivation. A landmark 1977 study by psychologists Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson demonstrated that people regularly confabulate. That is, they make up convincing explanations for their behaviors that have nothing to do with the actual unconscious causes. You think you know why you do what you do. The research suggests you often do not. Neuroscience has added further weight to this. Neuroscientist David Eagleman, in his 2011 book Incognito, notes that the vast majority of brain activity occurs below the level of conscious awareness. The conscious mind, he argues, is a tiny sliver of the overall activity of the brain. You are largely a stranger to yourself. The you believe yourself to be is a heavily edited highlight reel, produced by a part of your brain whose primary job is to maintain a coherent story about who you are. So what does this mean for you practically? It means that self-knowledge is not given. It is hard-won. It means that when you react strongly to someone, when you make decisions that confuse even yourself, when you find your life repeating patterns you swore you'd broken, these are not random. They are signals from the unacknowledged self. The first step of shadow work is not dramatic. It is simply this: develop a healthy suspicion of your own self-narrative. Begin to notice the gap between who you claim to be and how you actually behave. When those gaps appear, and they will, do not rush to explain them away. Sit with the discomfort. That discomfort is the door. You are more than you know, and that is not always a comfortable thought, but it is the most honest starting point I can offer you. Truth too. Everything you hate in others' lives inside you. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Carl Jung. This is the truth that tends to make people the most defensive. It is also, in my experience, the one that produces the fastest and most dramatic breakthroughs. So stay with me here, because I am about to say something that your ego is going to want to argue with. The qualities you find most intolerable in other people are, almost without exception, the qualities you have refused to acknowledge in yourself. This process is called projection, and it is one of the most well-documented phenomena in all of psychology. Sigmund Freud identified it as a defense mechanism. Jung went further, recognizing it as the primary way the shadow makes itself known in daily life. Here is how it works. When you disown a quality, say arrogance, that quality does not vanish. It takes up residence in the unconscious shadow. Because you have labeled it, not me, your psyche becomes hypersensitive to detecting it in the outside world. Every time you encounter someone displaying arrogance, your unconscious recognition of that quality in yourself triggers a disproportionate emotional reaction. You don't just find them mildly annoying, you find them intolerable. The intensity of your reaction is the fingerprint of the shadow. Clinical studies have supported this mechanism. Research published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2012 by Cara Lambert and colleagues found that individuals who were primed with threatening thoughts about their own undesired characteristics showed significantly higher rates of attributing those characteristics to others. The unconscious projects outward what it cannot tolerate inward. This does not mean that the people who irritate you are innocent. They may genuinely be unkind, dishonest, or selfish. The question is not whether the quality exists in them. It may well, but why your reaction is so charged. Why does their behavior live in you like a splinter? That charge, that intensity, that inability to simply observe and move on. That is the shadow speaking. Think about someone in your life who irritates you most deeply. Now ask yourself, with honest courage, is there any version of this quality inside? Have I ever in any context exhibited this behavior? Have I suppressed this tendency in myself? Often the answer when you truly look is yes. And with that recognition comes something unexpected. Not shame, but relief. Because when you can own a quality in yourself, you no longer need to be consumed by it in others. This is not about excusing bad behavior in others. It is about understanding that the mirror the world holds up to you is always partially reflecting your own interior landscape. And that is actually wonderful news, because it means you have far more power over your experience than you previously thought. Truth 3. Your shadow was built in childhood. The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. Carl Jung. Nobody is born with a shadow. You built yours piece by piece in response to the world you grew up in. This is not a blame exercise. Your caregivers built theirs the same way. But it is an important truth, because you cannot understand your current patterns without understanding their origins. Developmental psychologists have extensively documented what happens when children receive conditional love, that is, approval that depends on behavior. Dr. John Bowlby's attachment theory, developed between the 1950s and 1980s, established that children develop internal working models of themselves and others based on early relationships. When a child learns that certain emotions or behaviors result in withdrawal of love, criticism, or punishment, they learn to suppress those states. The suppressed material becomes shadow. Think about the messages you received explicitly or implicitly in your early years. Perhaps you were told that boys don't cry, so you buried your vulnerability. Perhaps you were praised exclusively for academic achievement, so you buried your playfulness, your creative chaos, your unproductive self. Perhaps expressing anger in your home was dangerous, so you buried your legitimate rage and learned to become compliant and people-pleasing on the surface, while the buried anger found other outlets: passive aggression, self-sabotage, depression. Alice Miller, the renowned Swiss psychologist, spent her career documenting the long-term consequences of what she called poisonous pedagogy. The cultural and familial practices that required children to suppress their authentic responses for the sake of adult comfort. Her landmark 1979 work, The Drama of the Gifted Child, showed how the most sensitive children, those most attuned to parental needs, are often the most thoroughgoing suppressors of their own authentic selves, and therefore carry the heaviest shadow into adulthood. The shadow then is not pathological. It is adaptive. It is what you did to survive your childhood. The problem is that survival strategies for a 10-year-old are frequently self-defeating for a 35-year-old. The part of you that learned to hide your anger, to avoid your father's wrath, is still hiding your anger in your marriage, your workplace, your friendships, and it is quietly destroying them. Understanding the childhood origins of your shadow is not about becoming a victim of your past. It is about becoming an archaeologist of your own psyche. When you understand why a particular quality was buried, you can begin the process of excavation with compassion rather than shame. The child who built the shadow was doing their very best. Now it is time to give them what they needed and never received: unconditional acceptance of all that they are. Truth 4. The shadow is not evil, it is exiled. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Carl Jung. I want to take a moment to correct one of the most common and damaging misunderstandings about shadow work: the assumption that the shadow is synonymous with evil. This mistake leads people to treat shadow work as a battle against their own badness, a campaign of inner warfare. That approach, I promise you, will make things worse. The shadow contains everything that has been exiled from the conscious self, and exile does not imply evil. In fact, Jung was emphatic that some of the most extraordinary human gifts live in the shadow. He wrote extensively about what he called the golden shadow, the positive qualities, the brilliance, the creativity, the strength, the passion that was suppressed, along with the qualities deemed negative. Consider a child raised in a family where intellectual ambition was seen as arrogant, or where artistic expression was dismissed as impractical. That child may have buried their brilliance in the shadow, just as thoroughly as another child buried their anger. When they grow up, they may feel unaccountably drawn to extremely accomplished or creative people, projecting their golden shadow onto them, while simultaneously feeling a confusing mix of admiration and resentment. They are looking at their own exiled potential in someone else's life. Research in positive psychology supports this dimension of the shadow. A 2014 study published in Psychological Science found that people who had difficulty owning positive qualities about themselves showed lower subjective well-being and were more prone to depression than those who could integrate both positive and negative self-perceptions. Your inability to own your own greatness is as psychologically costly as your inability to own your darkness. The shadow also contains instinctual energies that are genuinely necessary for healthy functioning. Anger, for instance, is not evil. It is information. It signals boundary violations. It provides the energy needed to protect what matters. A person who has buried their anger entirely does not become peaceful. They become passive, resentful, and eventually explosive. The anger needed somewhere to go. Your sexuality, your ambition, your desire for power, your capacity for aggression, none of these are inherently destructive. They become destructive only when they are unacknowledged and therefore unregulated, erupting sideways into your life rather than being consciously channeled. The goal of shadow work is not to eliminate these energies, but to bring them into relationship with your conscious values so they serve your life rather than hijacking it. Think of the shadow not as a dungeon full of monsters, but as a wilderness full of exiled citizens. Some frightening, yes, but many of them carrying gifts you desperately need. They have been living in exile for years, maybe decades. They are hungry and they are angry, but they are not evil. They are simply waiting to come home. Truth 5. You cannot destroy your shadow, only integrate it. What you resist persists. Carl Jung. There is a popular strain of self-help culture that I genuinely worry about. And I say this as someone who believes deeply in personal development. It is the culture of relentless positivity, the insistence that negative emotions are problems to be eliminated, that darkness is a glitch in your operating system rather than an intrinsic feature of human experience. This approach does not heal the shadow, it thickens it. The psychological term for the attempt to eliminate unwanted thoughts and feelings through willpower is thought suppression, and the research on its effectiveness is unambiguous. It does not work. A famous 1987 study by Daniel Wegner, which became known as the White Bear Experiment, demonstrated that instructing people not to think about a white bear caused them to think about it far more frequently than they otherwise would. When you aggressively suppress a thought or feeling, you create a rebound effect. The suppressed content becomes hyperactivated in the unconscious. This is precisely what Jung meant when he said the shadow grows larger with repression. Every time you insist, "I am not that kind of person," every time you shame yourself for having a dark thought, every time you perform positivity over genuine pain, you are adding another layer to the shadow's density. The material does not disappear, it consolidates. The same dynamic operates culturally. Nations that refuse to reckon with their historical atrocities, slavery, colonialism, genocide, do not transcend those histories. They enact them again and again in new forms. The sociologist C. Wright Mills observed that the most dangerous people are not those who know their capacity for evil and are vigilant about it, but those who are utterly convinced of their own righteousness. History provides ample confirmation. Integration, the Jungian alternative to suppression, is a fundamentally different operation. It does not mean acting out your shadow impulses. It does not mean becoming cruel because you have discovered a cruel streak, or acting on every forbidden desire because you have acknowledged it. Integration means developing a conscious, honest relationship with the material in your shadow. It means saying, "This quality exists in me. I see it. I understand where it came from. I can now make conscious choices about it." When you integrate rather than suppress, something remarkable happens. The energy that was locked in repression becomes available. The anxiety that came from not knowing decreases dramatically. Your relationships improve because you stop unconsciously projecting your unacknowledged qualities onto the people around you. You become, in a word, freer, not because you have become better, but because you have become more honest. Destroying the shadow is not an option, but befriending it, now that is both possible and profoundly transformative. Truth 6. Your shadow speaks in dreams. The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul. Carl Jung. Jung devoted a significant portion of his professional life to the study of dreams, and the findings were extraordinary. He believed, and the evidence he accumulated was formidable, that dreams are not random neural noise but purposeful communications from the unconscious mind. Specifically, he believed that the figures and events in your dreams frequently represent aspects of your own psyche that you have not yet integrated. Modern neuroscience has added complexity to our understanding of dreams without negating their psychological significance. Research published in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in 2010 by Matthew Walker and colleagues established that REM sleep, during which most vivid dreaming occurs, is critical for emotional memory consolidation and for dissolving the emotional sting from difficult experiences. In other words, your dreaming mind is actively processing emotional material, exactly what Jung proposed, though through a different mechanism than he imagined. In the Jungian system, the characters who appear in your dreams, people, animals, monsters, strangers, often represent psychological contents. A sinister figure chasing you may represent a shadow quality you are fleeing in waking life. The qualities of that figure are worth examining closely. What does it represent? Power, sexuality, rage, vulnerability? Whatever it is, the fact that it is pursuing you suggests it wants your attention. Recurring dreams are particularly significant. Depth psychologists observe that recurring dream themes represent unresolved psychological tensions, material that keeps surfacing because it has not yet been consciously processed. If you have dreamed for years of being chased, of failing an exam, of losing your teeth, of finding yourself in an infinite house with undiscovered rooms, these images are your unconscious mind's repeated attempts to deliver a message. You don't need to be a trained analyst to begin working with your dreams. The practice is simpler and more accessible than you might think. Keep a notebook by your bed. When you wake from a dream, write it down immediately. Not just the plot, but the emotional tone, the colors, the atmosphere. Then ask yourself, if each figure in this dream represented a part of me, what part would it be? What was I feeling? Where does that feeling appear in my waking life? You may be surprised what begins to emerge. Dreams have a particular genius for delivering truths that the waking mind is too defended to receive directly. They communicate in symbol and metaphor, languages that slip past the ego's senses. When you begin to listen, you discover that your unconscious has been trying to tell you something for a very long time. It is time, friend, to start listening. Truth 7. Your triggers are treasure maps. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. Here is a practice I want you to begin today, and I mean that quite literally. Every time you feel a disproportionate emotional reaction, every time you find yourself flooded with rage, shame, jealousy, contempt, or fear, in response to something that a reasonable observer might find relatively minor, stop. Breathe. And instead of asking, why is this person making me feel this way? Ask, what is this reaction telling me about myself? A trigger is not an attack, a trigger is a door, and the emotional intensity of your reaction is directly proportional to the significance of what lies on the other side of that door. The people and situations that provoke you the most are not your enemies. They are your most insistent teachers. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch psychiatrist whose 2014 book, The Body Keeps the Score, revolutionized the understanding of trauma, demonstrates extensively how traumatic memories are stored not in narrative form, but in somatic and emotional form, as bodily sensations, emotional states, and behavioral reactions that can be triggered by present-day stimuli that echo the original wound. When you are triggered, you are often not reacting to the present, you are reacting to the past. This is why a mildly critical comment from a colleague can send you into a spiral of shame that lasts for days. This is why your partner saying they need some space can activate a terror that seems wildly disproportionate to the situation. The present stimulus has touched an old wound, and the old wound is responding. The magnitude of the reaction tells you how deep the wound goes. Working with triggers as shadow material involves a three-step process. First, recognition. Notice that you are triggered. This sounds simple, but requires significant practice, because in the moment of triggering, the emotional response feels entirely justified and external. It really does seem like it's all their fault. Second, pause. Create enough space between the stimulus and your response to prevent unconscious acting out. Third, inquiry. With genuine curiosity, ask what old pattern, belief, or wound is being activated. What does this remind you of? When have you felt this way before? Over time, this practice transforms your most painful triggers into the most precise diagnostics available. You begin to understand your own architecture, the precise points at which your shadow exerts its greatest influence. And in that understanding lies not just freedom from reactive behavior, but the beginning of genuine healing. Your triggers are not signs of weakness. They are breadcrumbs left by the most honest part of you, leading you back to yourself. Follow them. Part 2. How the shadow sabotages your life. Truth 8. Your self-sabotage has a name, it lives in the shadow. The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved but only outgrown. Carl Jung. Have you ever been on the verge of something genuinely good? A loving relationship, a professional breakthrough, a period of real health, and found yourself inexplicably destroying it? Not through carelessness, not through circumstance, but through your own deliberate, if unconscious, actions. You picked the fight that didn't need picking. You made the reckless financial decision the week before the big opportunity. You stopped going to the gym the moment you started seeing results. This is self-sabotage, and it is not random. It is not weak will. It is the shadow enforcing what psychoanalysts call the upper limit problem, a term popularized by Gay Hendricks in his 2009 book, The Big Leap. The premise is simple and devastating. You have an internalized set point for how much happiness, success, love, or abundance you are allowed to experience. When your life begins to exceed that set point, the unconscious activates strategies to pull you back down to the level you subconsciously believe you deserve. Where does that set point come from? The shadow. In the deep layers of the unconscious. Most people carry a belief, formed in childhood, rarely examined as adults, that they are fundamentally flawed, unworthy, or undeserving of sustained happiness. This belief does not announce itself. It operates silently, pulling strings behind the scenes of your life. Jung called this the inferior function, the repressed aspect of the self that exerts its influence precisely at the moments when consciousness is least vigilant. Research in behavioral economics and psychology consistently confirms this pattern. Roy Baumeister's studies on self-defeating behavior, conducted at Case Western Reserve University in the 1990s, found that people engage in self-defeating actions not because they are masochistic, but because the behavior serves some other psychological purpose. Typically, the avoidance of a feared outcome or the maintenance of a familiar identity. You self-sabotage success because on some level, success feels more terrifying than failure. Failure, at least, is familiar. The path through self-sabotage begins with the willingness to ask an extraordinarily uncomfortable question. What am I afraid will happen if I actually succeed? Sit with that question. Let the answer come slowly and honestly. You may discover a belief that success will alienate you from the people you love, that it will expose you as a fraud, that it will require you to become someone you don't recognize. These beliefs live in the shadow, and they will run your life until you name them. Truth 9. Your shadow picks your romantic partners. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Carl Jung. I want to talk to you about love. Not the greeting card version, but the real, complicated, frequently maddening thing that happens when two human beings try to be genuinely close to each other. Because in no arena of life does the shadow operate more powerfully, more persistently, or more invisibly than in romantic relationships. Jung identified what he called the anima, the unconscious feminine principle in men, and animus, the unconscious masculine principle in women, as major archetypes that shape romantic attraction. But beyond these archetypal structures, there is a more immediately practical shadow dynamic at work. You are consistently attracted to people who carry the qualities you have buried in your own shadow. This is not romantic fate, it is projection, and it comes with an expiration date. In the early stages of romantic love, what Helen Fisher's neurological research at Rutgers University identifies as the dopamine-flooded attraction phase, which typically lasts between 18 months and 3 years, the projection is at its most intense. The person onto whom you are projecting your shadow qualities appears extraordinary, almost magical. They are mysterious or passionate or brilliantly intellectual or exquisitely sensitive, and your attraction feels like recognition. In a sense, it is. You are recognizing your own exiled self in them. Then the projection begins to fade, as projections always do. The person reveals themselves to be human, with needs, limitations, irritating habits, and their own shadow material. What was once thrilling becomes infuriating. The free spirit you adored is now irresponsible. The passionate person is now volatile. The sensitivity you found beautiful is now neediness. The relationship enters what therapists call the power struggle phase, which is in Jungian terms the collision of two shadows. The couples who navigate this transition successfully are the ones willing to ask, what quality in my partner that drives me crazy have I buried in myself? And conversely, what have I been projecting onto them that actually belongs to me? These questions, asked honestly and in genuine dialogue, can transform a power struggle into a profound deepening of intimacy. Understanding repetition, compulsion, Freud's observation, confirmed by subsequent research that people unconsciously recreate the emotional dynamics of their childhood wounds in adult relationships, adds another crucial layer. You may repeatedly choose partners who are emotionally unavailable, because unavailability is what love felt like as a child. You may repeatedly attract controlling partners, because control was the texture of safety in your early home. You are not broken. You are replaying a script that was written before you were old enough to revise it. The good news is that once you see the script, you can begin to change it. Shadow work in relationships is not about finding a better partner. It is about becoming more conscious of what you are bringing to the partnership and having the courage to own it. Truth 10. The shadow fuels addiction. Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol or morphine or idealism. Carl Jung. I want to approach this truth with particular care, because addiction touches many lives in ways that are deeply painful. And the last thing I want to do is add shame to an already shame-saturated subject. But the Yin Yen perspective on addiction is one of the most compassionate and, I believe, most accurate frameworks we have for understanding it, and you deserve to hear it. In 1961, Carl Jung received a letter from Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Wilson wrote that Jung's counsel to a patient named Roland Hazard had been a crucial, possibly the crucial, catalyst for the founding of A. Jung had told Hazard, after exhausting every conventional treatment for his alcoholism, that his craving for alcohol was the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. The addiction, in Jung's view, was a misdirected spiritual search, an attempt to transcend the unbearable constraints of ordinary ego consciousness and access something larger, more alive, more connected. Modern addiction research has added remarkable depth to this insight. Dr. Gabor Mate, the Hungarian-Canadian physician whose work on addiction spans decades of clinical practice, argues in his landmark book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, that addiction is fundamentally about pain relief, specifically the relief of emotional pain that cannot be tolerated consciously. The substance or behavior provides a temporary chemical override for states of anxiety, shame, loneliness, or emptiness that have been accumulated in the shadow. Neurological research confirms that addiction hijacks the brain's dopamine reward pathways. But the question worth asking is, what created the vulnerability to that hijacking? A 2010 study published in the journal Science found that social isolation in rats produced the same neurological changes as cocaine exposure, and that rats raised in enriched, connected environments showed dramatically lower rates of addiction to opioids when given the option. The shadow of disconnection from self and others is a primary driver of addictive behavior. This does not mean that addiction is simply a shadow problem with a shadow solution. Addiction involves complex neurobiological processes that require medical attention and community support. But it does mean that any recovery process that does not address the underlying emotional and psychological material, the shadow content that the addiction has been managing, is incomplete. You can stop drinking and still be driven by the same buried pain that led you to drink. The behavior changes, the wound remains. If you are struggling with any form of addiction, substances, food, gambling, screens, relationships, work, I want you to ask yourself this question not with judgment, but with genuine curiosity. What am I trying not to feel? The answer to that question is the beginning of the real work. Truth 11. Your need for approval is a shadow symptom. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Carl Jung. Let's talk about the approval hunger that most of us carry around like a chronic low-grade illness. A constant, exhausting scanning of other people's faces for signs that we are okay, that we are liked, that we are enough. The flinch when we sense disapproval. The relief that floods in when someone validates us. The lengths we go to in order to avoid conflict, criticism, or the devastating possibility that someone might not like us. Need for approval is not a personality trait. It is a shadow symptom. Specifically, it is the symptom of a core belief buried in the unconscious, that your authentic self, unfiltered, uncensored, fully expressed, is not acceptable, that if people saw all of you, they would leave, that love is conditional on performance. Psychologist Harriet Breaker identified what she called the disease to please, a compulsive need for approval that leads people to habitually sacrifice their own needs, values, and authenticity in the service of managing others' feelings. Research by Dr. Susan Cross Whitbourne at the University of Massachusetts found that chronic people pleasers show significantly elevated levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, even in neutral social situations, because they are constantly monitoring for signs of disapproval. The origins of approval, seeking almost always trace back to conditional love in childhood, when children learn that parental warmth is contingent on certain behaviors, being good, being quiet, being helpful, being successful. They develop what psychologists call a contingent self-esteem, a sense of worth that is perpetually dependent on external validation. The child who is praised when they performed and invisible when they did not carries that dynamic into every adult relationship. Here is the cruel paradox of people-pleasing. The more desperately you seek approval, the less of your authentic self you show. And therefore, the approval you receive is for the performance, not for you. Deep down, the approval seeker knows this: the validation never lands. It hits the mask and slides off. Because what you truly need is not for someone to approve of your performance, but for someone to love your reality. And they cannot do that if your reality is permanently hidden. Shadow work around approval seeking involves developing what researchers call secure attachment, an internal sense of worth that does not require continuous external confirmation. This is built gradually, through practices of honest self-expression, through the experience of showing up as you truly are, and discovering that the world does not end, and through the radical act of learning to give yourself the validation you have been seeking from others. Truth 12. Perfectionism is the shadow in a suit. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Carl Jung. Perfectionism gets very good press. We admire it, we reward it, we put it on job applications as our most charming weakness. My biggest flaw. I just care too much. But I want to offer you a different perspective, one that is less flattering and considerably more useful. Perfectionism is not a high standard. It is a fierce strategy. Brené Brown, whose research on shame and vulnerability at the University of Houston has reached millions of people through her books and TED Talks, makes a crucial distinction between healthy achievement orientation and perfectionism. Achievement orientation is driven by a desire to grow and produce quality work. Perfectionism is driven by the belief that if you are perfect, you can avoid judgment, rejection, and the experience of shame. It is a protection racket run by the shadow. The perfectionistic person lives in terror of being truly seen, not the polished, high-performing, everything under control version of themselves, but the actual human being underneath, with needs and failures and confusion and fear. Perfectionism is the elaborate structure, built to ensure that no one ever gets close enough to find the frightening truth, that underneath all that competence, there is a person who does not feel good enough. Research published in Psychological Bulletin in 2017 by Andrew Hill and Thomas Curran found that perfectionism has increased significantly in the general population over the past 3 decades and is strongly associated with anxiety disorders, depression, and eating disorders. The same study identified socially prescribed perfectionism, the belief that others expect you to be perfect, as the most psychologically damaging variant and the one most strongly linked to suicidal ideation. The shadow content underlying perfectionism typically includes a profound shame about being ordinary, about making mistakes, about being human. This shame was almost always instilled in childhood, through parents who communicated, directly or indirectly, that failure was intolerable, that love was earned through achievement, that good enough was never enough. The child learned to armor themselves in performance. The adult has forgotten there is anything underneath the armor. The antidote to perfectionism is not mediocrity. It is genuine self-compassion, the ability to hold your own failures with the same kindness you would offer a close friend in distress. This is not softness. It is actually the condition necessary for genuine excellence. Because when you are not terrified of failure, you are free to take the creative risks that produce truly outstanding work. Perfectionism doesn't produce excellence. It produces paralysis, burnout, and a gnawing sense that nothing you do is ever quite enough. Truth 13. Rage is an unheard voice. The pendulum of the mind alternates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong. Carl Jung. Anger has a terrible reputation. In most cultures, particularly for women and for men raised in certain traditions, anger is the emotion most aggressively exiled into the shadow from childhood. We are taught to suppress it, transcend it, manage it, or, in more spiritual circles, to release it as though it were simply noise. But anger is not noise. Anger is information. From an evolutionary perspective, anger is a survival signal. It activates in response to perceived threats, injustices, or violations of boundaries. It provides the physiological energy, increased heart rate, adrenaline release, heightened alertness, needed to respond to danger or to defend what matters. In healthy psychological functioning, anger arises, delivers its message, is registered consciously, and informs an appropriate response. Then it subsides. The problem arises when anger has been so thoroughly exiled into the shadow that it cannot complete this natural cycle. The person who has learned that their anger is unacceptable, dangerous, shameful, too much, does not stop having anger. They stop having conscious anger. The anger goes underground and finds other outlets. Passive-aggressive behavior, chronic depression, which many clinicians identify as anger turned inward, physical tension and illness, explosive rage that erupts seemingly without cause, or the sustained resentment that quietly corrodes relationships over years. Research published in the journal Psychosomatic Medicine has linked chronic anger suppression to significantly elevated risks of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, and immune system compromise. A long-term study conducted by the Harvard School of Public Health found that individuals who reported suppressing anger had twice the cancer mortality rate of those who expressed anger appropriately. The body, as Evander Colt reminds us, keeps the score. The shadow's anger finds a way to speak, even if it has to speak through the flesh. The goal of shadow work with anger is not to become a person who expresses every irritation indiscriminately. It is to develop a conscious, honest relationship with your anger, to notice when it arises, to hear what it is saying, and to make conscious choices about how to respond. This requires first breaking the deep conditioning that labeled anger as inherently dangerous or shameful. Your anger, when given a voice in safe conditions, typically carries a clear and legitimate message. A boundary was violated, a value was transgressed, something important was dismissed or ignored. When you learn to hear that message instead of suppressing it, you gain access to an extraordinary source of self-knowledge and to the energy needed to protect what you love. Truth 14. Jealousy shows you what you have abandoned in yourself. The greatest tragedy of the family is the unlived lives of the parents. Carl Jung. Jealousy is one of the most universally uncomfortable emotions and one of the least examined. We feel it, we hate ourselves for feeling it. We try to suppress it, and we rarely sit still long enough to ask what it is actually telling us. But jealousy, approached with Jungian eyes, is one of the most precise instruments of self-knowledge available. When you feel genuine jealousy, not the mild wistfulness of seeing someone with a nicer car, but the deep, sometimes painful longing that arises when you witness someone living a life, or expressing a quality that moves something very deep in you, you are almost certainly looking at your golden shadow. You are witnessing a capacity, a possibility, or an aspect of aliveness that you have abandoned in yourself. The novelist, who is consumed with jealousy toward a celebrated peer, is usually not jealous of their fame. They are jealous of their permission, the permission they have given themselves to create, to be seen, to take their art seriously. The person jealous of their friend's passionate relationship is not jealous of the specific partner. They are jealous of the vulnerability and openness that makes such a relationship possible. Research in social comparison theory, pioneered by Leon Festinger at MIT in the 1950s, and elaborated extensively since, confirms that we most intensely compare ourselves to people who are similar to us and engaged in activities that are personally relevant. We don't feel profound jealousy about things we don't care about. The intensity of your jealousy in a particular domain is a measure of how much that domain matters to you and how much you have denied yourself permission to engage with it. There is a particularly poignant dimension to this that Jung identified in his observation about the unlived lives of parents being transmitted to children. When a parent has suppressed a significant aspiration, a creative calling, an intellectual passion, a life less conventional than the one they chose, that suppressed energy does not dissipate. Research in family systems therapy suggests it is often unconsciously transmitted to the next generation, who feels inexplicable drives toward the thing their parent never allowed themselves. So the next time jealousy arises in you, instead of drowning it in shame, try asking, what quality in this person do I want for myself? What have I been telling myself I cannot have, be, or do? What permission have I been withholding from myself that they appear to have freely given themselves? These questions transform jealousy from a humiliation into a compass, pointing directly toward the unlived life that is calling you home. Truth 15. Victimhood can become a shadow defense. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Carl Jung. This is one of the more delicate truths in this book, and I want to approach it with the care it deserves, because there is a profound and important difference between acknowledging genuine trauma and victimhood, which requires compassion and validation, and a particular psychological pattern in which the victim identity becomes a fixed, defended structure that paradoxically prevents healing. Both are real. Both need to be named. Let me be unambiguous. Trauma is real. Injustice is real. People are genuinely hurt by circumstances, by other people, and by systems that fail them. Acknowledging this is not weakness. It is accuracy. It is accuracy. A person who has been abused, discriminated against, or severely disadvantaged deserves to have that reality witnessed and validated. To dismiss this is to commit a further injury. None of what I am about to say applies to the simple act of acknowledging what has actually happened to you. What I am pointing to is a different phenomenon: the unconscious investment in the victim role as a stable identity, a source of meaning, and a protection against the terrifying possibility of agency. When the victim identity becomes the organizing center of the self, any recovery, any circumstance that would require relinquishing the story of injury becomes unconsciously threatening. The person remains in some essential way perpetually at the moment of the original wound. Psychologist Martin Seligman's foundational research on learned helplessness, conducted at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1960s and 70s, demonstrated that when animals, and by extension humans, experience repeated uncontrollable negative events, they learn not merely that this situation was uncontrollable, but that situations in general are uncontrollable. This learned helplessness then persists, even when circumstances genuinely change and agency becomes available. The brain, primed by past powerlessness, fails to recognize present possibility. Shadow work around victimhood is among the most demanding and requires the most careful, compassionate execution. It involves simultaneously holding two truths. Yes, this happened to you, and it was genuinely harmful. And also, you have more agency in your present life than your conditioning allows you to believe. This is not a call to get over it. It is a call to grieve fully, which is different from staying permanently in the wound, and then to begin the terrifying and liberating work of discovering what you are capable of choosing even now. The shadow of victimhood holds, paradoxically, your unclaimed power, and claiming that power is not a betrayal of your pain. It is the most complete honor you can give it. Truth 16. The shadow corrupts power. Where love rules, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, there love is lacking. Carl Jung. There is a recurring tragedy in human history that presents itself with remarkable consistency across cultures, eras, and contexts. The person who acquires significant power or authority undergoes a troubling transformation. The idealistic young politician becomes the corrupt official. The visionary founder becomes the abusive CEO. The spiritual teacher becomes the manipulative guru. We observe this pattern with weary familiarity, shake our heads, and conclude that power corrupts. But Jung would push us deeper. Power does not corrupt, it reveals. Specifically, it reveals the shadow that was always there, merely undetected. What happens psychologically when a person achieves significant power? The external constraints that previously kept the shadow in check Social accountability, financial dependency, the need for others' cooperation are progressively removed. The person becomes less subject to consequences. The ego begins to inflate, merging with the power they hold rather than maintaining a healthy distinction from it. Jung called this inflation, the state in which the ego has been possessed by an archetype, in this case the archetype of power itself. A comprehensive analysis of leadership and narcissism, published in the Academy of Management Review in 2006, found that many of the qualities that help leaders rise to positions of authority, charisma, boldness, vision, ruthlessness, are also characteristics of narcissistic personality disorder. The very traits the system selects for are the traits most associated with shadow-dominated leadership. The Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971, conducted by Philip Zimbardo, demonstrated how rapidly ordinary people, with no prior history of cruelty, began to exhibit abusive behaviors when placed in positions of institutional authority over others. Though the study's methodology has been critiqued in recent years, its core finding, that situational power activates shadow material with disturbing speed, has been replicated in numerous subsequent studies. The antidote, both personally and institutionally, is the cultivation of what Jung called the examined life for those in power. A rigorous, ongoing commitment to shadow work, to accountability structures, and to the radical humility that comes from genuinely knowing one's own capacity for harm. The most dangerous leader is the one who has never looked honestly at their own shadow. The most trustworthy is the one who has, and who has built systems around themselves to compensate for what they find there. Part 3. The Full Revelation. The Deepest Deception. Truth 17. You lie to yourself more than anyone else ever could. Of all the people in your life who have deceived you, there is one who has done so most consistently, most cleverly, and with the most devastating consequences. That person is you, not through malice, but through the psyche's relentless drive to maintain a coherent, bearable narrative about who you are and what your life means. Psychologists call the primary mechanism of this self-deception cognitive dissonance reduction, the process by which the mind resolves the discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs by distorting one of them. Leon Festinger's landmark, 1957. Work on cognitive dissonance established that when our behavior conflicts with our beliefs, we are far more likely to revise our beliefs than to change our behavior. We don't acknowledge the lie. We revise the standard by which it would be a lie. The most consequential self-deceptions are the ones that protect the core shadow, the belief that you are not angry when you are, that your motivations are altruistic, when they are not, that you forgave someone when you merely buried the resentment, that your self-destructive patterns are external circumstances rather than unconscious choices. These stories feel true. They are constructed by the most sophisticated narrative engine in the known universe, your human brain, but they are stories nonetheless. The practice of radical self-honesty, the willingness to question your own narratives with the same rigor you apply to others, is not about becoming a self-critical machine. It is about developing a loving, clear-eyed relationship with your own complexity. You are allowed to be contradictory. You are allowed to have shameful impulses and noble aspirations simultaneously. You are allowed to be human. What you are not served by is the pretense that you are not. Truth 18. Spiritual bypassing is shadow avoidance in disguise. There is a particular irony in the fact that one of the most sophisticated forms of shadow avoidance presents itself as spiritual advancement. Psychologist John Welwood coined the term spiritual bypassing in the 1980s to describe the use of spiritual beliefs and practices to avoid dealing with unresolved psychological wounds, developmental needs, and the ordinary human messiness of emotional life. You have almost certainly encountered this. The person who talks extensively about love and light, but becomes icily punishing when criticized. The meditator who has managed to become more emotionally distant rather than more genuinely open. The person who deploys concepts like non-attachment to avoid grieving losses. Everything happens for a reason, to avoid feeling legitimate anger about injustice, or we are all one to bypass the hard work of genuine repair in broken relationships. Genuine spiritual development and shadow work are not in conflict. In fact, the deepest traditions of mysticism, from Christian contemplation to Zen Buddhism to Sufi practice, include extensive frameworks for confronting the shadow of the self. The problem arises when spiritual practice is used as a more sophisticated version of the same avoidance that characterized earlier stages of psychological development. The form has changed. The function is identical. The test is simple. Is your spiritual practice making you more genuinely open to difficult emotions, more capable of honest relationship, more present to the full reality of your life and others' lives? Or is it making you more defended, more certain of your own advancement, and more comfortable in a bubble of elevated self-concept? Growth that cannot bear contact with difficulty is fragile. Real transformation produces groundedness, not transcendence. Truth 19. Your greatest strengths have a shadow twin. This truth will require the most honest people you know to pause and sit with some discomfort, because every virtue you genuinely possess, every quality you are rightfully proud of, has a shadow counterpart that you are probably considerably less proud of. And the stronger the virtue, typically, the more powerful the shadow twin. The highly empathetic person, the one who is genuinely attuned to others' pain, carries a shadow of boundary dissolution, of losing themselves in others' emotional reality, of attracting emotionally dependent people, because their empathy functions as a magnet for those who have never learned to regulate their own feeling. The deeply generous person carries a shadow of martyrdom and resentment, giving beyond their actual capacity, and then feeling quietly victimized by the recipients of their generosity. The visionary carries a shadow of dismissing present reality in favor of the imagined future. The deeply loyal person carries a shadow of enabling harmful behaviors in those they refuse to abandon. Understanding the shadow of your strengths is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to develop what psychologists call self-complexity, a richer, more nuanced understanding of who you are that can hold both your gifts and their costs and make conscious choices about when and how to deploy those gifts. Truth 20. The shadow makes you moralize. Have you noticed that your most righteous moments, the times you feel most certain of your moral superiority, are often accompanied by an emotional intensity that goes somewhat beyond the situation? That the crusades you engage in most passionately tend to involve themes that have a particular charge for you personally? That the behaviors you condemn most vehemently in others are the ones you are most invested in not exhibiting yourself? Moral outrage, when it is genuinely proportionate to genuine injustice, is healthy and necessary. But a great deal of what presents as moral concern is actually projection in ethical clothing. The most vociferous opponents of sexual freedom in public life have shown a consistent pattern of private sexual behavior that contradicts their public positions. The people most loudly contemptuous of weakness in others are frequently engaged in a continuous, exhausting war against their own vulnerability. The more intensely you crusade against a particular quality, the more worthwhile it is to ask, where does this quality live in me? This is not moral relativism, not the suggestion that all positions are equally valid, or that genuine injustice should not be challenged. It is the observation that the emotional charge you bring to a moral position is diagnostic information about your own interior life. Jung called this the moral inflation that accompanies unintegrated shadow. The certainty of one's own righteousness is precisely correlated with the depth of one's unacknowledged darkness. Truth 21. You fear your own potential as much as your darkness. Marianne Williamson famously wrote, and the passage is often misattributed to Nelson Mandela, that our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate, Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. Jung had anticipated this insight decades earlier. He observed that the golden shadow, the exiled potential, the greatness, the authentic brilliance, is often more terrifying to integrate than the dark shadow, because greatness comes with exposure. It comes with the expectation of performance, with the possibility of envy, and with the loss of the comfortable identity that says I'm just ordinary. Research by psychologist Robert Arkin and colleagues on self-handicapping. The strategy of creating obstacles for oneself before performance to provide a ready excuse for failure demonstrates how people consistently sabotage their own success to avoid the psychological stakes of genuinely trying. If you never fully commit, you never fully fail, but you never fully live either. Truth 22. The body stores what the mind refuses. The connection between psychological material and physical symptoms is one of the most robust findings in psychosomatic medicine, and one of the most consistently underestimated by people engaged in shadow work. Van der Kolk's research and his 2014 book, The Body Keeps the Score, represent perhaps the most comprehensive synthesis of the evidence. That trauma and suppressed emotional experience are encoded not just in memory, but in the nervous system, in patterns of muscular tension, in chronic pain, in autoimmune responses, and in the regulation of physiological stress systems. Wilhelm Reich, an early student of Freud's who later developed his own body-oriented approach to psychology, proposed the concept of character armor. The chronic muscular tensions and postural patterns that develop as a way of holding in check the repressed emotional and instinctual material that the individual cannot consciously tolerate. Contemporary somatic therapists work with exactly these patterns, recognizing that shadow material held in the body must be released through the body, not merely through intellectual understanding. If you carry chronic tension in your jaw, your shoulders, your pelvis, your chest, and if that tension does not resolve with ordinary physical treatment, it may be worth asking what you have been clenching against. What are you holding in? What has the body been keeping safe that the mind refused to acknowledge? The body in this sense is the most honest part of you. It cannot lie the way the mind can, and its symptoms are often the most precise available communications from the shadow. Truth 23. Your inner critic is a shadow gatekeeper. The inner critic, that relentless internal voice that catalogs your failures, predicts your humiliations, and tells you that you are fundamentally too much or not enough, is not your conscience. It is not wisdom. It is the internalized voice of the people and systems that originally required your suppression, now living rent-free in your own mind and doing their work from the inside. Research in cognitive psychology consistently shows that the inner critic operates through cognitive distortions, systematic errors in thinking that were identified and catalogued by Aaron Beck in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy. Catastrophizing, mind-reading, black and white thinking, and personalization are among the most common. These are not rational assessments. They are the psychological equivalent of a security system that was programmed for a different threat environment and never updated. Shadow work with the inner critic does not mean silencing it. That is suppression again. It means developing the capacity to observe it rather than be consumed by it, to ask whose voice it carries and what purpose it originally served, and to gently but firmly begin to offer alternative narratives that are more accurate and more compassionate. Over time, with sustained practice, the critic's volume decreases and its authority weakens. You discover that the voice that claimed to be protecting you was actually imprisoning you. Truth 24. You are capable of the things you most condemn. This is the hardest truth in this book. I want you to receive it not as an accusation, but as an act of profound respect for your full humanity. Hannah Arendt, reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1963, coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe her discovery that the Nazi administrator responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust was not a monster or a psychopath, but a disturbingly ordinary man, a bureaucrat, motivated primarily by careerism and the desire to follow orders, who had simply never developed the habit of thinking critically about his actions. Her finding devastated the comfortable theory that evil is the province of a separate category of inhuman beings. Philip Zimbardo's subsequent research, along with Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments of the 1960s, in which 65% of ordinary American participants were willing to administer what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks to strangers on the instruction of an authority figure, confirmed Arendt's observation at scale. Ordinary people, under the right or wrong conditions, are capable of extraordinary harm. Jung understood this with extraordinary clarity. He wrote that it is a prime condition of psychological health to know one's own shadow, not to act on it, not to celebrate it, but to know it, to acknowledge that you, like every human being, contain the capacity for cruelty, dishonesty, cowardice, and harm. This acknowledgement is not self-condemnation. It is the condition of genuine vigilance. The person who knows their capacity for cruelty watches themselves carefully. The person who does not is the most dangerous one in the room. Truth 25. The shadow is collective, not just personal. Individual shadow work is only half the story. Jung recognized with great clarity that the unconscious has a collective dimension, that nations, cultures, religions, and tribes carry their own shadows, their own repositories of denied, projected, and disowned material. And the consequences of collective shadow are far more devastating than those of individual shadow, because they play out on a historical scale. Every culture projects its shadow onto some other: the neighboring tribe, the religious minority, the foreigner, the group whose difference makes them available as containers for the qualities the culture refuses to acknowledge in itself. The history of prejudice, colonialism, genocide, and war can be substantially read as the acting out of collective shadow. The qualities most aggressively attributed to the despised group, laziness, sexuality, aggression, cunning, are almost always the qualities the dominant group has most aggressively suppressed in its own self-image. Collective shadow work requires the same fundamental operations as personal shadow work. The willingness to look honestly at what has been denied, to acknowledge harm perpetrated in the name of the collective, and to integrate the rejected material rather than continuing to project it outward. For nations and cultures, this work is rarely comfortable and never complete, but it is the difference between a society that is capable of genuine development and one that is condemned to repeat its most destructive patterns. Truth 26. Humor and sarcasm often mask the shadow. Laughter is one of the most beloved human experiences, and humor deployed with genuine warmth and self-awareness can be one of the most connecting, healing, and liberating tools we have. But there is a version of humor that serves a very different function, a shadow function. Sarcasm, in particular, is what psychologists sometimes call hostility with plausible deniability. It allows the expression of aggression, contempt, or resentment with the escape hatch of "I was just joking." The person who deploys constant sarcasm is often a person with significant suppressed anger, who has found a socially acceptable channel for it. The dark joke that everyone knows "I'm only kidding" may be the most honest thing they have ever said, the shadow speaking through the comedian's mask. Similarly, chronic self-deprecating humor can function as preemptive shame management. If I make the joke about my failures first, you cannot wound me with it. And humor that consistently targets a particular group or type of person reveals, with Jungian reliability, the qualities the comedian most needs to disown. Humor, like dreams and triggers, is a royal road to the shadow, and learning to ask, "What am I actually saying here?" of your most pointed jokes can be extraordinarily illuminating. Truth 27. Your money patterns are shadow patterns. Money is one of the most emotion-laden topics in human experience, and consequently one of the areas where the shadow exerts its greatest influence. Your relationship with money is almost never simply rational. It is encoded with deep beliefs about your worth, your safety, your identity, your power, and your deepest fear. Research by Dr. Brad Klontz, a financial psychologist at Creighton University, who has developed the concept of money scripts, unconscious beliefs about money formed in childhood, has identified 4 major patterns. Money avoidance, belief that money is bad or corrupting. Money worship, belief that money will solve all problems, money status, belief that self-worth equals net worth, and money vigilance, belief that one must always guard against financial catastrophe. All 4 are shadow patterns, distortions produced by unexamined beliefs inherited from family systems. The person who can never hold on to money, no matter how much they earn, is often unconsciously enacting a belief that wealth is not for them, too dangerous, too corrupting, or simply undeserved. The compulsive saver who lives in perpetual financial anxiety despite objective security is often replaying early experiences of deprivation or instability. The compulsive spender is often using money to temporarily fill a void that has nothing to do with material need. Follow the money, as the saying goes. It will lead you directly to the shadow. Truth 28. Loneliness is sometimes the shadow's quarantine. Chronic loneliness, not the situational loneliness of transition or circumstance, but the deep, persistent sense of being fundamentally unreachable by others, is one of the most painful human experiences. It is also, in many cases, a shadow phenomenon. The parts of yourself that you have deemed most unacceptable are also the parts you most fear others will discover. And so, to protect yourself from the devastating experience of being truly seen and found wanting, the shadow constructs an invisible wall. You are technically present in relationships, socially active perhaps, but never fully accessible. The loneliness you feel is the gap between the mask and the self behind it. John Cassiopos, decades of research on loneliness at the University of Chicago, established that chronic loneliness is as physically damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, increasing the risk of premature mortality by 26%. The pain of loneliness, his research suggests, is an evolutionary alarm signal, the social equivalent of physical pain, indicating that something necessary to survival is absent. But when the loneliness is created by the shadow's quarantine of the authentic self, no amount of social activity resolves it, because the problem is not lack of contact, but lack of genuine self-disclosure. Truth 29. Integration is a lifelong practice, not a destination. I need to disabuse you, kindly but firmly, of a fantasy that the self-help industry has done enormous damage by cultivating. The fantasy of arrival, the idea that there is a point at which you will have processed enough, healed enough, worked enough on yourself, that the shadow will be resolved and you will move into a condition of permanent psychological peace. Jung was explicit on this point. He did not propose individuation, his term for the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole, as something that could be completed. He proposed it as a direction, a orientation, a continuous deepening. New life stages bring new shadow material. New relationships activate new projections. New power reveals new dark potentials. The person who believes they have finished their shadow work is the person who most needs to begin it again. This is not depressing. It is actually deeply liberating. Once you release the exhausting demand that you should be further along than you are, the work is not a problem to be solved. It is a relationship to be tended. A continuous, honest, compassionate conversation with the fullness of your own humanity. And that conversation, sustained over a lifetime, produces not perfection but something far more valuable. Genuine wisdom, genuine compassion, and the kind of deep-rooted freedom that does not depend on circumstances. Truth 30. Meeting your shadow is the beginning of real freedom. We have arrived at the last of the 30 brutal truths, and I want to end not with darkness, but with the extraordinary possibility that lies on the other side of this work. The journey into the shadow is not a descent into misery. It is, paradoxically, a journey toward greater joy, not the brittle, performed happiness that requires continuous maintenance of the mask, but the deep, resilient aliveness that comes from being genuinely, fully, honestly yourself. When you stop spending energy on suppression, projection, and self-deception, that energy becomes available for living. Clinical research on psychological integration consistently shows its benefits. A 2019 meta-analysis of psychodynamic therapy, published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, found that the deepest and most lasting therapeutic gains occurred in treatments that addressed unconscious material, precisely the shadow content this book has been exploring. People who develop a conscious relationship with their previously denied psychological material show sustained improvements in depression, anxiety, relationship quality, and overall life satisfaction that continue to grow even after therapy has ended. Jung called the goal of this process individuation. The becoming of the individual one truly is, rather than the performance of the individual one believes one should be. It is a life oriented toward authenticity rather than approval, toward wholeness rather than perfection, toward honest relationship with all that you, rather than the curated presentation of what you wish you were. You have been running from your shadow for a long time, my friend. The running is exhausting, and what you have been running from, this dark, exiled, complicated, occasionally frightening part of yourself, is not the enemy of your freedom, it is the door to it. The monster in the mirror has been waiting with great patience. It is time to look it in the eyes, and when you do, you will discover something extraordinary. It looks back at you with recognition and with relief, because it has been waiting all this time to come home. Part 4. The Shadow Work Practice, Tools for Integration. Journaling your shadow. Writing is one of the most powerful tools available for shadow work because it creates distance between you and your experience. Enough distance to observe it, but not so much distance that you lose contact with it. The act of translating your inner life into language requires a degree of conscious engagement that can reveal patterns invisible from inside the emotional experience itself. The most effective shadow journaling is not a diary of events, but an inquiry into your reactions. Rather than recording what happened, record how you responded, and then with genuine curiosity ask why. The following prompts are drawn from both Jungian practice and contemporary psychological research on self-reflective writing. What triggered me most intensely today? And what does the intensity of my reaction tell me about what is unresolved in me? Which quality in another person am I finding most intolerable this week? Where does that quality live in me, even in small ways? What am I avoiding feeling by staying busy, scrolling, drinking, or otherwise numbing? If I knew I could not fail or be judged, what would I do or say or be that I am currently withholding? James Pennebaker's research at the University of Texas, spanning several decades, has established that expressive writing about emotional and psychological experience produces measurable improvements in physical health, immune function, and mental well-being. The mechanism appears to involve the narrative construction of coherent meaning from previously fragmented emotional experience. Precisely what shadow journaling accomplishes. Write without editing. Write without the intention of showing it to anyone. Write with the understanding that what emerges, however unexpected or uncomfortable, is valuable information about the person you are becoming. Working with dreams. Begin a dream journal tonight. Keep a notebook and pen by your bed, and make it your practice to write down whatever you remember from your dreams within the first minutes of waking, before the rational mind reasserts its censorship. Do not worry about making sense of what you write. Simply record the images, emotions, and atmosphere. Once you have a record of several dreams, begin to work with them using the following approach. For each significant figure, person, animal, or creature, in the dream, ask, if this figure represents a part of me, what part is it? What qualities does it display? What is it doing in my dream? What feeling does it produce in me? Pay particular attention to figures you find threatening or repulsive. These are the shadow's most direct communications. The monster chasing you, the dark stranger, the figure you are hiding from. What quality do they embody? Disgust, in this context, is not a reason to look away, but a reason to look more carefully. Jung's own technique of active imagination, which we will address in the next chapter, can be applied to dream figures, engaging them in imagined dialogue to hear what they have to say. For now, simply record and observe. The patterns that emerge over weeks and months will begin to tell you a great deal about the architecture of your own unconscious. Active imagination. Active imagination was Jung's own primary method for engaging with the unconscious, and it remains one of the most powerful and underutilized tools in the shadow work practitioner's repertoire. It involves entering a state of relaxed, receptive attention and deliberately engaging with the figures, symbols, or images that arise from the unconscious, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant. Begin by finding a quiet space where you will not be disturbed for at least 20 minutes. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow your mind to settle. Then invite an image to arise, perhaps a figure from a recent dream, or the personification of a feeling or quality you have been working with. Do not force anything, simply create the invitation and wait. When an image or figure appears, engage with it as though it were real, speak to it. Ask it what it wants, what it represents, what message it carries. Listen for a response, which may come as words, images, feelings, or simply an intuitive knowing. Record everything that arises, either by writing or by sketching. Active imagination is not visualization in the conventional sense. It is not about constructing desired images. It is about receptivity, about allowing the unconscious to speak in its own language. What arises may surprise or disturb you. Receive it with curiosity rather than judgment. The figure that appears most frightening often carries the most important message. Jung cautioned against becoming overwhelmed by active imagination material and recommended that people with fragile ego structures or acute psychological distress work with a trained therapist when engaging this technique. For most people in stable psychological conditions, however, active imagination practiced with care and curiosity is a profound accelerator of self-knowledge. Conclusion: the wholeness that waits on the other side. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, Carl Jung. Friend, we have come a long way together through these pages. We have walked through the architecture of the shadow, its origins, its mechanisms, its surprising gifts, and its remarkable tenacity. We have looked together at 30 truths that the ego would prefer to avoid, and we have survived the looking. That in itself is not nothing. I want to leave you with the most important thing Jung ever said about this work, which is also the simplest. You cannot become whole by addition. You cannot achieve genuine psychological health by accumulating more positive qualities, more achievements, more spiritual insights. You achieve it by subtraction, by removing the barriers between yourself and the fullness of what you already are. The shadow is not something foreign that needs to be conquered. It is the rest of you, waiting to be welcomed home. The research I have cited throughout this book tells a consistent story. Psychological integration, the honest acknowledgement and acceptance of previously denied aspects of the self, produces measurable, lasting improvements in mental and physical health, in relationship quality, in creativity, in resilience. This is not mysticism. This is science confirming what the mystics have always known, that wholeness heals, but the research cannot give you what only the work itself can give you. It cannot tell you what it feels like to sit with a long exiled part of yourself and feel for the first time the grief and the relief of its return. It cannot tell you what it is like to stop projecting your anger onto others and to feel instead the clarity and the energy of owning it yourself. It cannot tell you what it is like to stop performing yourself and to discover, underneath the performance, something genuinely extraordinary, not perfect, not beyond reproach, but real, achingly, beautifully, undeniably real. You are not broken, you are incomplete. And that is a very different thing. The parts of you in the shadow are not damaged goods. They are exiled citizens, carrying gifts they have been trying to give you for years. The work ahead of you is not a project of repair. It is a project of reunion. Jung spent the final decades of his life not searching for greater certainty, but for greater depth, a willingness to hold the full paradox of human experience, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, known and forever mysterious. He died in 1961 at the age of 85, reportedly at peace, in a way that those who knew him attributed to a lifetime of honest inner work. That peace is available to you too, not at the end of some distant journey, but now in this moment of choosing to look honestly at what you have been avoiding. Every act of genuine self-honesty is already wholeness in practice. Every moment you choose curiosity over defense, inquiry over judgment, honesty over performance, you are already living the integrated life. The monster in the mirror has waited long enough. It is time to open the door.